has been brought to you by the letter M.
All right, so we're over the hump. We're up to letter N, which is just over the halfway point through the alphabet. And N is for Neanderthal. Now, I bet you think you know a lot about Neanderthals, but let's see if I can prove you wrong. You see, for the longest time, the word Neanderthal was basically a slur meaning stupid, primitive, or backward.
I realize we old-timers, we grew up. If you called someone Neanderthal, that was an insult. Like, they're still evolving Neanderthal.
Comparing someone to a Neanderthal help convince them to change course and get on board with your public health message.
But thanks to archaeology, that stereotype is slowly changing. So let's start at the beginning. Who and what were the Neanderthals? Well, the Homo neanderthalensis are members of the hominid family, but we're not descended from them, us Homo sapiens. They're more like cousins of ours. In fact, we Homo sapiens actually lived side by side with the Neanderthals for a time and had some pretty intimate relationships with them, but more about that later.
Good morning, sunshine. Are you using my toothbrush?
So where did that ridiculous name Neanderthals come from? Well, the type specimen, and that's not the first ever found, but that's when a certain specimen of a species is whole enough and looked at by biologists who use it to define a new species and set out its defining characteristics. Well, that specimen for the Neanderthals was found in the Neander Valley in West Germany way back in the 1850s or 60s. So Neander Valley, hence Neanderthal. Now, a few inches shorter than modern humans, they're distinguished by their squatter, heavier build and those bulbous, prominent facial features. However, some of those silly-looking physical traits actually had evolutionary benefits that were adapted for the cold weather. You see that big wide nose? It could actually warm the air before it was breathed in. They also had specialized fat storage abilities as well, again, to guard against the cold weather.
You're not fat. You're big-boned.
That's what I said.
Now, the Neanderthals lived a long time ago. It's not exactly certain when they appeared. There's a lot of different estimates for that. But they went extinct about 40,000 years ago. Now, Homo sapiens, if you recall, they appeared between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. So that's actually a lot of a long period of overlap. However, that overlap was effectively limited by geography. As we know, human beings came from Africa, but it took them a long time to spread out of the continent, and of course there was some back and forth movement as well. Well, the Neanderthals were concentrated in Europe, although their range seems to have spread all the way to the Far East in Central Asia to the Altai Mountains. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it should. If you remember, that was also the origin of the Scythian population that we discussed in a previous episode. Anyway, one of the things that archaeology has long since taught us is that the Neanderthals were not the stupid, primitive cavemen that they're often portrayed to be, or at least compared to human beings at that time, no more or less stupid than we were. In fact, fun fact, they had a bigger brain than we do.
Do you know the human head weighs 8 pounds?
So how can I prove that to you? Well, some of this that I'm about to tell you is a little controversial based on the dating information, but the Neanderthals had a lot of the things that we humans associate with culture and civilization. For example, they had art. This art ranges from carved bones, like that bear bone we discussed in the cave in Poland a few episodes back when we were talking about microwear analysis, or similarly this carved raven bone. They had music. Check out this bone flute made out of a bear bone, just like the one in Poland. Now, if you want to see this, you can find it at the National Museum of Slovenia, which I must say, for being in such a small capital city, Ljubljana, it has an amazing collection of prehistoric stuff, going back from this bone flute tens of thousands of years, all the way up to the Iron Age and Roman times. They had technology, like their own style of lithic tools called Mysterian. Now, that name Mousterian comes out of a site called Le Moustier, where it was first identified. And just like with species, we use that term in archaeology when a type of something, maybe not is first found, but first really identified and characterized at a particular site. And then the type of artifact takes on the name of that site. Le Moustier is a cave in France, and maybe Spain have the heaviest concentration of Neanderthal. And incidentally, early humans had a different style of stone tools like those you see here. And when we see the changeover of that in the archaeological record, that's when we can identify the changeover in a site from Neanderthal to Homo sapien occupation. They made other useful tools. For example, the Neanderthals apparently wove plant fibers into rope, and that was discovered when we found a microscopic bit of that rope on a work stone flake. They also apparently collected, admired, and worked little bits of things that they considered precious, like seashells and fossils and quartz crystals. Not that different from modern humans. Think about, those curios cabinets in the early modern times, or even the funny little things we collect today, like refrigerator magnets. Now, some of these, the Neanderthals apparently wore as personal ornamentation, like, for example, these bird talons that were found in a site in Croatia called Krapina. That's a cave site where Neanderthals lived that I visited when I was there. So the museum was a little bit tacky, but it was informative, and it was definitely cool to see the cave site where the Neanderthals actually lived. Definitely worth a visit if you're in or around Zagreb in Croatia. Now, another thing we can see at Krapina and some other Neanderthal sites is a little bit less savory characteristic of our Neanderthal friends, and that's that they apparently engaged in cannibalism, which we can tell from these butchered bones that were remaining.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Well, isn't that special?
Now, some of this might be ritualistic defleshing of corpses, and there's that archaeological BS word, ritualistic. But anyway, we do see, even in later human contexts, some cultures do sort of remove the flesh from corpses as part of funerary practices and do things with the bones. However, given the context and the amount of this stuff that we find, it is likely that the Neanderthals did engage in some, shall we say, indulgences of the flesh.
You're delicious.
I don't indulge in pleasures of the flesh.
However, when they weren't eating each other, they actually may have been healing and caring for each other. And this is going to be some really cool application of archaeological science. You see, in studying human remains, one of the things you can look at is dental calculus. Now, not the math. Calculus is another fancy word for like tartar or plaque on your teeth. Well, in analyzing some Neanderthal teeth and looking at very, very carefully at the plaque buildup, researchers actually identified some plants that have known medicinal qualities, but no nutritional benefits and are actually somewhat unpalatable to eat. For example, chamomile, with its variety of known medicinal and palliative properties.
I'm just sipping on chamomile.
It's even been argued that the widely dispersed skeletal evidence showing trauma and injury that had actually been healed is evidence that Neanderthals actually cared for the sick and helped them to get better, which is what enabled these individuals to survive. Now, this brings up another unfortunate fact of Neanderthal living, which is that the skeletons show a very high incidence of stress, trauma, injury, and illness. In fact, it seems like more than 80% of them died before the age of 40. And yes, in studying bones, we can actually get a pretty good estimate of the age at death, especially the better preserved skeletons. So yeah, it was a stressful life. But even with that stress, the early death, that little bit of cannibalism, that was not enough to scare early humans away. Because we have multiple proof points, better I'd say even than videotape, of human to Neanderthal loving, interbreeding.
That's a dirty little message.
me, Kay, you dirty little messenger.
First, we have bone and fossil samples of humans and Neanderthals which are intermingled at the same sites, particularly in the Middle East. We have intermingling of those different types of stone tools that I mentioned earlier. But the most damning evidence we have of all is, of course, the DNA evidence.
What's up? In the case of 9-month-old Cairo, Kwan, you are the father.
And we've learned quite a lot from studies of both modern and ancient DNA. For example, a lot of people, many people, have trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA. Not lots. I mean, the highest end of different estimates I've seen is about 8%. If we look at different populations of human beings, the least amount is generally found in sub-Saharan Africans who just have traces of a percentage point, and that probably didn't even come from Neanderthals directly, but instead from intermixing with other humans that had Neanderthal DNA. And oddly, the highest levels of Neanderthal DNA generally are found in East Asians. Now, why is that weird? Remember, the Neanderthals only made it to Central Asia. No traces of them have been found in East Asia. So that's probably just testament to the fact that humans migrated around a lot and this history of human beings is pretty complicated. However, remember, we're generally talking about small amounts, lower single digits. Now, that's the modern DNA. Of course, the ancient DNA has taught us quite a bit too. It seems like as of now, there's about 40 Neanderthal genomes that have been published. And oddly, over a dozen of those came from two sites in the Altai Mountains, those mountains, again, in the Mongolia-Russia area. And again, what's weird about that is that's the easternmost extremity of the Neanderthal sort of living range. What the study revealed, not surprisingly, is that a lot of the members of this small community were related. We had a father and a daughter, for example. Moreover, like most documented human societies, Neanderthals seem to have been patrilocal, meaning that it was the females, the women, that went to go live with the families and communities of their mates or husbands, although they probably didn't have the concept of marriage that we do. And now this part gets into one of the inherent weaknesses of the Neanderthals that probably was a huge factor contributing to their extinction. And that's that they had a very small population size and gene pool as a result. At any given time, there were only thousands or maybe low tens of thousands of them. Thus, they were not very genetically robust. They likely shared a lot of the same genetic vulnerabilities due to the limited gene pool. They lived in small, isolated communities of very sparsely populated, meaning that there was very likely a lot of, shall we say, close family relationships.
So if we have the same mother, tonight I'm gonna my brother.
And we know that's never good for the gene pool. Just ask the Habsburgs. So by the time modern humans came into contact with them, bad stuff was in store for the Neanderthals. Perhaps just like the Native Americans, they were vulnerable to disease, and there is some evidence of that. Maybe they were even killed in conflicts with humans, at least some of them were. Or perhaps they were just sort of bred out of existence in the face of better adapted Homo sapiens. In any event, it's probably a mix of all of these factors. So they seem to have made their last stand about 40,000 years ago in this area of northern Spain. Whatever the case may be, the fact is the Neanderthals do live on. They live on in us, in our DNA, even if it's only 1, 2, or 3% of it. So to summarize, if you've learned anything from this video, I hope it's that, number 1, the Neanderthals were not the primitive cavemen we often think them to be. In fact, they probably were not even really any less competent than Homo sapiens living at the same time, just less well-adapted from an evolutionary standpoint. And number 2, look at how powerful archaeology can be in reconstructing such ancient history. Look at all of the archaeological tools we've brought to bear. DNA analysis, skeletal analysis, dental analysis, lithics, isotopes, you name it, we've done it. And that, my friends, is the power of archaeology. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.